Thank you. Thank you for this invite. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be here, actually. And I'm moving on from the part where the importance of having the data and having all the analysis when it comes to what we check, where the hazards are, where the contaminants are, to what else is required in order to actually be able to assess, to have a risk assessment for our population. So therefore, we go into the importance of food consumption data in the risk assessment. And starting, we'll say that in order to have an effective food risk assessment, fundamentally, we need robust and accurate data on population-specific intake consumption data. This is important. Up to now, we have nutritional epidemiology, we have nutrition, and we focus on what is healthy and what is not healthy. What we tend to forget is something, in order for a food to be healthy, it actually has to be safe as well. Therefore, we need to include this parameter in the analysis and when we are assessing and formulating specific guidelines. Therefore, we need to assess the population exposure, and as you heard, we very often have health reference standards that come from a lot of analysis and population information, and various research that has been done. Concentration data for foods and other environmental aspects, like just now, Professor Thamaidis just informed you all the information on all the nice work that have been done in order to be able to assess what is found in various foods and in the environment where these grow. But what we also need, and where there's a challenge, is the accurate and representative food consumption data. And this is what I'm going to be focusing on and trying to relate and stressing the importance of it. Therefore, as you probably heard from the first session of today, there are 4 pillars for risk assessment framework: hazard identification, hazard characterization, and where we need, in order to have exposure assessment and risk characterization. For the specific areas, we need data on consumption, other two, the chemical characterization. So this is the input. This is what we need to conclude. Dietary exposure estimate, So chemical characterization on data in food is being done. Processes are being developed. Processes are being validated slowly. What we also need in order to have a complete information and be able to accurately define and therefore appropriately, completely prioritize is the food consumption data. There are various assessment types. It all depends what we want to focus on. Is it acute exposure that we're looking into, or is it chronic exposure that we're looking into? If something is very high, then we need acute exposure also. If something is long-term and it slowly accumulates, and therefore there's a trend that we have specific levels, as you heard from Professor Thamaidis, that are there and are found in the environment, there we want chronic exposure as well to be able to model overall. Therefore, what type of questionnaires are required in order to get this information, and how accurate are these? How can we proceed? Then we go into the consumption types. We have, for some foods items, there's very small intakes, and therefore we need long-term in order for something to accumulate, where others have relatively large amounts that are found in there. And some examples of these are bulk sweeteners, for example, or modified starches, nitrates and nitrites, which I will be giving you an example on this as well. Therefore, we need to be able overall to merge all this consumption data in order to be able to have a chemical characterization from foods. Therefore, we need, in order to have the merging of consumption data, it is not possible if we don't have information on some consumption data for all the analyzed foods. Therefore, even if we do have the analysis in foods, what is in there? What are we consuming? Earlier, we were discussing during the break when it comes to the intake of various poultry, for example. Therefore, we have analysis, from what I understood from Professor Thamaidis, that have been done, and from the National Health Survey, which I will be introducing now, and the importance of it, we have intakes. Therefore, combining this data, we will proceed in a nice formulated risk assessment for specific population in Greece, and therefore, if possible, for different age groups. Because this is part of the risk ranking framework. I'm sure you heard this throughout this morning, and we have the purpose of it is a systematic and structured approach for ranking microbial and other chemical risks to inform food safety decisions. In order to have this, we need critical data requirements, which are high-quality representative food consumption data. This is formulated and requested from World Health Organization, from FAO, and from EFSA as well. Okay? And therefore, population-specific exposure data in order to be able to have comprehensive hazard characterization. I will move on to the dynamic considerations where we have an evolving, however, food supply and knowledge around it. There are emerging, we have some hazards that have been there, but there are also emerging hazards that are coming up. And therefore we need to take into account the changing population demographics and consumption patterns. Not only do we need consumption intakes, but based on that from specific demographic subpopulations, sex and age groups that you'll see, but also based on the trends and the differences in the changed population, also how this also proceeds in order to go into the implementation requirements. Therefore, complete population considerations and in risk assessment, we have the general population that we usually focus on, but we also need to have the critical groups, therefore being able to assess infants and children, pregnant women, the elderly, now vegetarians, because we have a high trend and we see an increasing amount of vegetarians and vegans coming up, and also other vulnerable groups in terms based on their different exposure, even if this is specific to their health status. Here I can give an example for individuals and patients that have been going through cancer or are high risk for cancer, and therefore different chemicals like nitrates and nitrites found or from processed meat that can further increase, as we know from specific research that has been developed and coming up during this last decade. Therefore, I also would like to stress the evolution of food consumption data collection, what we have and what we need after all. Usually, risk assessments are based on food balance sheets because these are readily available. And these include the amounts of food available for human consumption, and these are derived from national statistics, and therefore what is produced and what is disappeared. So this is an overall framework and not actual and accurate data. This is an overall estimate for the population. We do not know what infants are consuming or what the adults or the elderly are consuming, the vegetarians or other individuals. So we have what is produced, what is given for animal feed, and what is exported. And of course, we consider what is imported as well. And therefore, this is a gross per capita estimate. We have data collected using population-based methods. Very often, this is at the household level. Again, this is a better estimate, but again, a rough estimate. What we need is data for individual food consumption, and this comes from national surveys. And the problem is that even where they are done, we usually don't have this publicly available at the individual level, and we rely on summary statistics. And therefore, this is where the National Food Consumption Survey, this graph, and up to recently, it was used to monitor food consumption trends and assess nutritional status. We tend to forget that it is also very important in order to be able to evaluate the hazard substances and therefore also dietary and develop other policy and impacts of that. What we need to consider therefore for effective risk assessment, again, we have varied data collection methods that are being performed across member states in Europe. It is very difficult to conduct EU-wide analysis and being able to compare this data if the methods that we collect and we use differ because they're not harmonized. Therefore, we have ongoing requirements, regular updates needed due to the changing consumption patterns that we said, and the continuous monitoring of dietary trends. This is where EFSA came in, and in 2009, they developed the first focused national dietary surveys and the recommendations, but in the beginning, in 2009, this was based on to monitor population nutritional status, like we said earlier, from the graph that I showed you, and therefore being able to analyze nutritional epidemiology and have macro and micronutrients intake assessment and relate that to health status. In 2014, this was refined to include and indicate the collection of high-quality data that have also information from and can be used to perform exposure assessments. Therefore, we have a lot more detailed information, and this is where FoodX2 comes into play in order to ensure data suitable for chemical and biological exposure as well, therefore supporting the food safety aspect. The availability of detailed, harmonized, and high-quality food consumption data collected at an individual level is essential in order to be able to improve the quality exposure assessments. There are still many challenges. Achieving representativity, specific methodological procedures need to be developed and followed as requested in order to have representative samples and subsamples of the population for higher risk groups, as I introduced earlier. Obtain high-quality food consumption data and, of course, accurate data. And food descriptors for exposure assessments. We also need to maintain balance between data quality and the participant burden. We may require, we want to have as much information as possible, but there's also the burden that we need to take into account. Therefore, what we prioritize is also what we have knowledge up to date, and therefore, from the analysis that have been performed from various foods and environments can be used to assess that and prioritize. Therefore, we want to avoid low response rate that we see coming up. And from the 40%, this is being dropped to 20% response rate as we see today, in order to be able to finally harmonize food lists across the member states and improve the food descriptors based on EFSA, like I said, FoodX2, food classification and description system. I will not stay at this specific table, but this is an overview of the various methods being used in order to collect information and data and have nutritional assessment and food information. We usually know and use the food frequency questionnaire, the 24-hour recalls, and dietary records. Up to now, what I want to stress is the dietary records were used and were assumed that they're more accurate. What we tend, because we weigh and record everything we consume. But what we tend to forget is very often, because there's a high burden, we usually tend to change our dietary intake the days that we actually record it. And therefore, like ESA recommends, what we want to know is 2 24-hour recalls and a food propensity questionnaire, which is a qualitative assessment in order to be able to assess more accurately intakes and nutritional food descriptors. Therefore, we need to population-specific data matter. We need to stress that, and understanding what different segments of the population actually consume across age groups, sex, and cultural backgrounds to identify and prioritize hazards. This is an example that we have performed by my team, and this is Dr. Kotopoulos, Sotiria, and Professor Zambelas that we analyzed, and we try to assess nitrites and nitrite intake, have a risk assessment based on intakes from the National Hellenic Council Nutrition Health Survey that we performed specifically for children and adolescents, young adults, so therefore for all population distribution as you see here. This is the ADI value that everything was compared to, and we see the higher exposures and the highest consumers, which is the 95th percentile distribution. What we wanted to stress is that the proportion of population per age group that exceeds the ADI is shown here. So we have the young adults, 18 to 30, that overconsume processed meat and get high levels of nitrates and nitrites from processed meat. But is this enough? We need to know where is this coming from, and therefore we developed an assessment to see where the highest food group contributors from the processed meats are that relate, and therefore being able to compare this information and therefore know what to change and what to assess. Therefore, future perspectives and conclusions, we need to go beyond nutritional aspects and enhance exposure risk assessment capabilities, call to action for comprehensive data collection using correct and specific methodological approaches that can be compared throughout the member states, Participants' feedback is required, and therefore to improve future survey design and assessment methods. And we need to ask also the risk assessors on the non-nutrients that are about their needs before we collect the data, and therefore prioritize and work as a team. To conclude, overall, we have comprehensive food consumption data is essential for accurate assessment, like we stressed again and again. Data are required for vulnerable populations, and in order to be able to harmonize the consumption data methods in MS is essential for comparisons. A balance between data quality with participant burden should be maintained, however, throughout, and this is where teamwork come into play based on the information that we have for the contaminants and the work that has been done from the risk assessors. Thank you.